Right, so for a short while there had been hope that the days of UK arms sales to Israel would be numbered, would actually soon come to an end once Starmer's new Attorney General, Richard Hermer, took up his new post. Given that this guy has been a critic of Israel and being Jewish himself, that carries some weight. Plus he has never held any particular political position previously, so was seen as unsullied and would be something of a breath of fresh air. This was the guy who would ensure Starmer didn't overstep, some thought. The guy who would make sure that Starmer did follow international law despite his pro-Israel proclivities. Well, it would appear Hermer has instead handed Starmer a get-out-of-jail-free card with regard to Israel arms sales, because instead of blocking arms sales to Israel outright, Hermer has intervened to say he wants distinction drawn between weapons that can be considered offensive or defensive where it comes to arms sales to Israel, and until Foreign Office officials can be certain that weapons sold to Israel wouldn't be used to violate international humanitarian law, he won't ban arms sales at all. Right, so we had such high hopes for the new Attorney General Richard Hermer, didn't we, when we saw the incumbent in that position during the general election campaign, Emily Thornberry, shovelled off to the back benches instead of being kept in post. She had gone along completely with Starmer's narrative in continuing to support Israel, arm Israel. So the introduction of Hermer, a guy with a good reputation, a guy who had been demanding Israel observe international law in response to the Hamas incursion of October the 7th, and was himself Jewish, was himself also unsullied by any political position prior to coming into Starmer's government. This was unusually good optics. There was hope that this was exactly the right sort of guy to ensure that Starmer was also made to observe international law, and on the matter of ongoing arms sales to Israel, which the Tories had been typically shady over as much as they were adamant they were going to continue. Well, it seems arms sales are going to continue, and Hermer has handed Starmer what seems to be a really crazy excuse to my mind to ensure that they do continue. And it comes back to who's really being observant of international law. Now, I'm obviously not a lawyer. I'm no legal expert. I don't pretend to know better the law here than Richard Hermer or even Keir Starmer for that matter. But the optics of this decision are nuts in light of international legal decisions that have already been made. The International Court of Justice has already made the ruling that there is a plausible case for genocide being committed by Israel against Gaza. We know about that. Gaza has been razed to the ground one end to the other. We know that too. There is also the matter of Israel's occupation of Palestine having been ruled illegal, though only in an advisory capacity. That was still a huge move by the ICJ. That said, surely it still carries some weight, though, even if it is just advisory. Does that not matter at all? Shouldn't it? Should it not be something you factor into your observations and decision-making, especially when it comes to international law? Israel as an occupying power has a responsibility, a duty of care towards those it occupies. Whilst its occupation was still deemed a legal one, a perverse concept if ever there was one, they flouted that. They enacted apartheid, and had done for decades, which is why the legality of that occupation was overturned. As an occupying power, though, they have no right to blow to bits those they occupy, but those who are occupied have every right to resist that occupation. Palestine has been occupied since 1967. We're 3 or 4 generations into occupation now. Whole generations knowing nothing except being under the boot of Israel. And yet, despite all of this, Richard Hermer is not going to ban arms sales until the Foreign Office has been able to differentiate between what counts as a defensive weapon and what counts as an offensive one. Seems ridiculous. How can you differentiate when what truly matters is, of course, how Israel choose to use what they get given? And we have no say or influence over that, do we? Well, I thought I'd have a go. Anyway, I thought I'd have a go at looking at what counts as a defensive weapon and what doesn't. And I found a handy article in Forces News. Who better to know the difference in the military itself, you might think. It certainly was the logic that occurred to me. Now, the article I found applies to Ukraine, but the point still stands, because as the article states, given Ukraine were attacked, were invaded by Russia, notwithstanding the eastward expansion of NATO, which is what triggered Russia, but any weapon they choose to deploy can be construed as being a defensive one, in which case. But that isn't helpful when you're trying to draw a line, a distinction between what can be ostensibly proven in a court of law as being a defensive weapon, as is the case here with Richard Hermer's intervention, and what counts as an offensive one instead. The only items you could prove to be avowedly defensive would be ones that cannot be used in an offensive manner in any practical sense or way. And the example Forces News gave was anti-tank missiles. Now you might think, well, they can be used to attack people as well. Surely a missile is a missile. But They have very, very short range, and they're designed specifically to take out an offensive weapon, i.e. a tank, which is certainly an offensive weapon. Now, just because that is the example the Forces News article gives doesn't necessarily mean that can be proven in a court of law, of course. That's different. And if we translate that over to selling weapons to Israel, well, Hamas don't have any tanks. So if that's the only example this article could come up with, surely this is a really silly situation right now. Everything else we could sell them could be counted as offensive, surely. Any kind of gun, any missile that can be shot over a reasonable range, any parts for jets which obviously are used in offensive combat. The list of what counts as offensive and what doesn't would appear to be a very, very one-sided one. Surely there is no sensible debate to be had here. The Starmer government clearly doesn't want to ban arms sales, but also doesn't want to end up dragged to The Hague over it. They need to find a differentiation that would stand up in court. But here's the kicker. If they can't differentiate, then nothing ends up functionally changing. The argument as put by the Foreign Office is on ensuring Israel are upholding international law, when of course we know that is a joke. We know they aren't. They can't be if they are plausibly seen, as the ICJ have ruled, to be committing a genocide. Here's an excerpt from Middle East Monitor addressing the situation further. Hermer's intervention comes after British Foreign Secretary David Lammy launched a review into whether the UK should continue arms sales to Israel amid the occupation's ongoing offensive on the Gaza Strip and the war crimes Israeli forces are perpetrating there, with a focus on banning the offensive weapons whilst maintaining the supply of defensive ones. According to the newspaper, a spokesperson for the Foreign Office simply stated that the government is committed to upholding international law. We have made clear that we will not export items if they might be used to commit or facilitate a serious violation of international humanitarian law. It highlighted the ongoing review process to assess whether Israel is complying with international humanitarian law, which the Foreign Secretary initiated on day one in office. We will provide an update as soon as that review process has been completed. Although Lammy was expected to announce the results of the review before MPs departed for their summer break, that has been delayed, specifically due to the fact that senior government figures are still uncertain over their ability to defend their distinction between offensive and defensive in court. So in a perverse sense, Starmer's laughing here. Richard Hermer won't ban arms sales unless the Foreign Office can prove the difference between what counts as an offensive or a defensive weapon when it comes to selling arms to Israel. So arms sales can just continue in the meantime. The Foreign Office doesn't think it's able to do this, so the arms sales can continue, and Starmer can point to this Hermer legal advice as his justification to carry on selling arms to Israel, and nothing ends up changing at all, save Starmer getting himself out of a hole on a technicality. It makes no difference in the eyes of the general public, though. Starmer will still be despised for not ending arms sales. The humanitarian law decisions, sadly so far all advisory, are ignored as a result of no concrete rulings, but Starmer is still so early into this parliament, he's still in the zone where he thinks he can afford to be as hated as you like, and this situation will go away yet for him before he needs to worry about how his party is polling too much. I'm sorely disappointed in Richard Hermer here. You'd imagine the scenes of genocide being meted out over the last 10 months in Gaza, all off the back of a one-night incursion by Hamas, would be seen for the disproportionate and illegal response it must be, but quibbling over how to label various armaments is going to excuse more arms sales yet, it seems. And of course, whilst he and the Foreign Office debate the labelling of various weapons, anyone reporting on the situation in the Middle East right now risks being criminalised. The arrest of independent British journalist Richard Hermer on this matter for reporting the truth and not the spin coughed up by our mainstream media proves that, as this video recommendation for your next watch goes into the details of, and I'll hopefully catch you on the next vid. Cheers, folks.